personally speaking, I have many gods.
When we think about ourselves and the who we are, it's so many infinite things.
The acceptable positions are monotheism and atheism, and that there is even a back and forth between these.
If one would say one is made in the image of God, and if there are as many images of God as there are people, then our own encounter with God.
We've lost the logical sense of the term peculiar. And isn't that peculiar?
Oh, dear diorama, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh, dear diorama, tell me why is the good never good enough?
All right, welcome back to another Platonic Mysticism. Today we are joined by one of my favorite people on this planet, polytheist, philosopher, spiritualist, author of The Way of the Gods and many other numerous texts that many people all over the world find very helpful for being initiated into pagan polytheistic intellectual practice. And I have always admired Edward and Edward's work. And so I am just pleased as punch, as my mama used to say, to have you on this show. And I thought I would open, and I got permission to open this way, so everybody know, with a kind of anecdote about about sometimes when I'm at conferences and Edward Butler's work comes up, I will get people being like, yeah, it's really important work on Henads and all of these things. But then somehow or another, they'll end their praise with, but did you know he believes this stuff? And there's always this kind of weird, like, why is this the kooky thing? Like we don't do this with authors who are Christian and believe in Christianity. Why do you think you get this reaction to people being they admire your work, they see the detail, they see how hard it is to unpack Proclus's Henads. If you've read the Platonic theology, this stuff is very dense, and so it takes the kind of mind who can be patient and scholarly and organized. But then for some strange reason, people want to dismiss it because you are a practicing polytheist.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly something that I've gotten used to over the years. I mean, I've been getting that, right from when I first started doing conferences after I defended my dissertation in 2004. 2003 actually, and as soon as I started doing conferences, then, the year after that, um, this was a familiar sort of thing that I encountered, and I've never had a thin skin about it. Um, I think that obviously it's an extreme minority religious position, although, not as much, not as small of a minority as people might think. It's a contested term, to describe or to self-describe various traditions. But I think that where it becomes a properly intellectual problem and not just a sort of social, a bit of social awkwardness, is in the kind of notion that people have that there is something inherently uh, less credible about many gods than about one god, which obviously goes directly to the issues in the history of ideas and the issues in the history of the reception of Plato's philosophy and of ancient Greek philosophy more generally, and also of the philosophical traditions of other civilizations, um, that has disposed us to believe that there is a kind of a telos toward monotheism, a kind of historical or intellectual or spiritual inevitability of it, rather than seeing it as the kind of historical contingency that we deal with in all kinds of other cases where we're talking about the kinds of rough edges of traditions that bump up against each other and the kinds of difficult encounters that they've had. Um, but to find it inherently implausible, of course, is then something that has to be addressed as a philosopher. Whereas to simply find it odd is something that one deals with just as a human.
It's so funny to me because there have been so many cultural shifts to where, to believe in the one God. So I think of Porphyry's attack against the Christians for being atheists because they deny, right, other gods besides the Christian gods.
Yeah, that was the kind of implication of calling someone an atheist in late antiquity to actually deny any gods was the kind of atheistic move or impious kind of move. Whereas today, oddly enough, one finds that there's a certain alliance between monotheism and atheism. A friend of mine who I went to school with in the philosophy department at the New School for Social Research, said to me, he characterized it in the kind of jovial spirit that we had in our exchanges and that I had with so many of my classmates in that department. Um, there's only one God and he doesn't exist. Which I think is actually a very insightful characterization of actually something which almost amounts to a kind of a mainstream position among many Western intellectuals that the acceptable positions are monotheism and atheism, and that there is even a kind of a circuit back and forth between these, which I think many Western intellectuals actually find very comfortable. Um, and surprisingly, particularly many of those who are deeply engaged in the study of religion find that going back and forth, as it were, between those positions, balancing those two positions, to be very congenial, intellectually congenial to them. Whereas polytheism is the really difficult position um, uh, for monotheists, for atheists. I mean, sometimes, more perhaps for atheists than for monotheists,
Uh,
curiously.
So this brings me to a couple of questions about your work. But before I ask those particular ones, maybe it might be interesting to see like are why polytheist rather than henotheist?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, a term like henotheism, there were a cluster of sort of exotic terms for religious positions that came up in the 19th century.
Mhm.
And henotheism is one of these, monolatry is another. Um, no two authors really define these positions the same, for one thing, but more importantly, to me, these these both of those terms particularly were terms which were part and parcel of the reception of polytheist traditions, traditions. If we dispense right now with the labels, but traditions that were descriptively polytheist, let's say, that prima facie presented as having many gods, whether we're talking about the religions of Western antiquity or we're talking about many contemporary continuous traditions. And the reception of those traditions in the Western academic context in the 19th and early 20th centuries gave birth to a number of terms that seem to have had the purpose of trying to explain away the polytheism, trying to explain away the multitude of gods. And I mean, you know, there was nothing descriptively controversial in any of these traditions before they were challenged very aggressively and often within a colonialist context, of course, challenged very aggressively on the multiplicity of their gods. And then a process began of attempting to negotiate, always in conditions of asymmetrical power relations, to try to negotiate some acceptable description that would not result in further ostracism, further marginalization for their traditions. And so, in particular, if we look at the kind of triangular relationship between the dominant West's reception of its own ancient tradition and its encounter with non-Western continuous traditions, continuous from antiquity, that triangular relationship, mediated by a powerful Western academy, which was backed by all of the colonial infrastructure of modernity, and also, of course, by a certain deference to the church, which even in the era of the secularization of the Western academy persisted and has persisted, a deference to a Christian reading of history. Um, all of that to speak to the history of ideas. You know, as a matter of personal description, there was just no reason for me to use any more exotic term. I mean, personally speaking, I have many gods, and so there, to get into, there was no reason for any other descriptor.
No, I love
And
that,
the
right?
people
Like,
who I was encountering, people who I was meeting and sharing my experiences with, and who had the same kinds of experiences, were describing themselves in the same way. And so it was felicitous, because it was also about a kind of a moment in the contemporary Western pagan community when people began to get more specific about exactly what they believed and exactly how their beliefs were structured. Um, and a lot of people at right around the same time began self-consciously describing themselves as polytheists in order to lean into the resistance to the term, the difficulty that people had with the term. Because even if you were going to use some kind of a different term, if you couldn't get right that kind of discomfort around polytheism, if you couldn't find the right way to deal with that,
mm,
you're not going to arrive at a felicitous description with any other term either, because that problem isn't going to go away.
you right that we the proposed topic was thinking with the gods, and for me there are moments like this that remind me of the Greek practice of that when a stranger shows up at your door, that you treat it or him or her as a god, right? And it's sometimes it feels the same way with words when you're like selecting what you want to identify with. That somehow, I don't know why, it's a little messy. It's a little problematic, but that seems to be the right word. Like for me, pagan and Platonic are what I root myself in, right? Because the pagan aspect of being rural, to be a country bumpkin, to be a little bit, not sophisticated. It always made sense to me, right? And so this brings me to so your work speaks to the intellectual tradition of a polytheistic landscape for within Proclus and the late Neoplatonic tradition. Could you give us a short summary for people who haven't read your work, what you think are the most important aspects? But for me, and I hope Gareth would agree, how is it that it, is part and parcel, as you said, of your way of life, right? Like it's not just something you study, it's not just something you read about, but it's something you practice and live, and you believe that writing and commenting and teaching this stuff is actually part of your faith, if you will.
Well, I've been a polytheist for a good deal longer than I've been engaged with Platonic philosophy or with any philosophy. And so when I began reading these texts, it was initially with the expectation that what I was going to find there was going to be broadly in line with the impression I was getting in the secondary literature, which was that there was no properly philosophical articulation of polytheism as such in these philosophers, or perhaps in any philosopher, that the intellectual trajectory, the trajectory of the concept, because it was inherently a question of one over many, of identity over difference, that again, this idea of a telos that led toward monotheism. And within the history of ancient Greek philosophy, perhaps preeminent supposedly among the notions that was preparatory to monotheism, that anticipated monotheism, was supposedly the Platonic conception of the one itself. But when I began reading the texts for myself, stepping away from the secondary literature, I immediately began to experience a powerful dissonance that what I was seeing in these texts was very different from how it was being characterized. And those characterizations depended upon leaving a lot out and depended upon some very loaded interpretations of key terms, and particularly some very loaded interpretations of what kind of work the principle of unity was doing, what's called in Greek tohen, the one. Now, it helped perhaps that I had recently been reading a good deal at part of my philosophical reading about the problem of individuation in medieval philosophers. And what I saw when I began to read these texts was that the function of the one is as the principle of individuation. The one makes each thing one, whatever that thing is. That's what it does, very straightforwardly. Um, and furthermore, I began to see, of course, that there was this powerful operation of negativity with respect to the one as being any one thing itself. And so it was quite clear to me that whatever else the Platonists were saying, they were saying that we posit a principle called the one, called unity, because we find that everything that we can possibly conceive is some one thing. Secondly, they were very concerned to say that the one itself neither is nor is one, that it is not at all one thing, that a fortiori, then, it's not all things together. And so we were neither dealing with a transcendent unit of the kind that would resemble the God of the monotheist traditions, nor were we dealing with an all-encompassing wholeness or unity of all things of the sort that we would associate with what's characterized as a pantheist position. And so neither with a transcendent nor an immanent monotheism. And this immediately, of course, opened up to me the possibility that we actually had right here, in plain sight, as it were, precisely the philosophical articulation of polytheism that had been assumed to be nowhere at all. Uh, and of course, as I became more familiar with the doctrine of the Henads and Proclus, um, uh, explicitly and openly, here was his theory of the many gods. And so then it just became a question of the relationship between the Henads and the One. And I found that there was a way of reading fairly straightforwardly what Proclus says on the subject in such a manner as to arrive at an interpretation of the doctrine, which, while it may be controversial in a contemporary polemical context, um, is nevertheless perfectly consistent, and doesn't have to ignore any of the evidence, doesn't have to uh, either dismiss any elements of his doctrine or to treat them with anything less than a full grant of hermeneutic charity.
So for those who don't know, your doctrine of the Henads is about, how it is, or not your Proclus, but, your research that is bringing it out so that people can see it for themselves. That's a funny slip. But in any case, the point is that it kind of gives us that theoretical foundation for, how is it that we can understand at the highest of levels that you have an Artemis, you have a Zeus, you have a Demiurge, you have a Edward, you have this individual at its perfect, connection, right? But also kind of overflow into the lower levels of the divine, so to speak, touching like that golden chain. So it's a beautiful combination of this one, but this many, right? That is more like a contact, for me, at least that's how I interpret it, that keeps this kind of thread from the highest of heights to the lowest of lows, or the left and the right, or any analogy of a pole, if you will, between extremes. And so, would you mind speaking on that a little bit, just to help clarify for?
Sure. Well, I mean, first, just to begin with the term Henad, which obviously people aren't likely to be familiar with, it simply means unit. And so, just as we have a principle of intellect, nous, and we have intellects proceeding from it, so from the principle of unity, units proceed. The principle of unity is the principle by virtue of which there are units. And the primacy of unity over being in Platonism essentially states that things are units prior, metaphysically speaking, to their being, prior to their having what we term as essence. Now, what does all this mean? And I mean, essence, we get these kinds of terms like supra-essential, beyond being. And Plato already, of course, in the Republic speaks of the first principle as beyond being. What are we really talking about here? Well, essentially, as a logical doctrine, we're saying that before there can be properties of things that are shareable, there is the peculiarity or uniqueness of things. And so there is a procession from this peculiarity or uniqueness to the common space. And this is the procession from unity to being, is the procession from the peculiarity, the uniqueness of units to a shared space, a cooperative space, a common space. This is the broad arc of Platonic procession. And in a text like Proclus's Platonic theology, what we get is we get an account of the progressive constitution in stages of a common space among the gods, who are each god is beyond being because each god in their radical existence, um, uh, Proclus uses the term hyparxis, which will later get translated in the Latin tradition as existence. And so we get a glimpse of this in the medieval debates over the priority of existence over essence in a monotheist context. But this had an additional function in the full context of Proclean thought and thinkers within his broad tradition, which goes back through Plotinus and down after him to Damascus, the last scholarch of Plato's Academy in the West. Within that broad tradition, this distinction between existence and essence also has to do with the procession from one mode of unity to another mode of unity and the emergence of mediation among these many units, which allows them to be conceived as a many, because of course that requires that there is a unity of the multiple itself. And so you could say that it is the emergence of that, the very conception of the multiplicity as a multiplicity, which again is how we can get all of this language about a procession from unity to multiplicity without some kind of radical origination of the multiplicity, which Proclus and other Platonists are very clear that they want to resist. They don't see the gods as being generated from some finite singular into some finite multiplicity. And in this, they're actually thinking as part of a tradition that goes all the way back to Hesiod. Because in Hesiod's theogony, although it's not often noticed, we have this striking contrast because on the one hand, he says that the gods are all eternal, and yet he talks about their coming to be as well. And so he's not concerned to explain how he holds these two ideas in balance. But obviously, it's easy enough for him, and he expects it to be easy enough for his hearers that it's not going to be an exceptional stumbling block for them to think of the gods in both of these ways simultaneously. And I think indeed that it's common to many, if not all, polytheist traditions to be able to hold these in suspension, as it were.
Gareth, I thought I'd let you hop in if you want to.
Yeah, I was struck in a sense by what you were saying there, insofar as I mean the way, for instance, that you characterized the sort of Western development of monotheistic religion, as it were. But I was thinking of the sort of complicatedness of that picture in itself as well, in a way, insofar as, I mean, I think the allusion was to sort of papal authority when you mentioned the church. But I suppose if we look even within the schism between the Eastern and Western church in Europe, broadly cleaved, as it were, on the lines of a, let's say, Aristotelian and Platonic sunderance, let's say, then many of the things I think you were just discussing and describing appeared to me to be quite consistent with the both the dogmatic and, if you like, mystical ideas that one finds in monastic writings in the Eastern Church, for instance. Um, and even the debates around existence and essence that you refer to, I think, can be seen more within the light of a scholastic and Aristotelian uh, landscape in some ways. Um, yeah, I'm really interested. So I was listening attentively. I was fascinated by your work, and I was interested in how you were describing the sort of metaphysical nature of the principle of unity, as it were, and the relationship, as you say, that suspends a kind of unity and multiplicity into a kind of a continual dance of sorts. Um, and I'd be really interested to hear a little more from you in your research about how um, we could understand this in relationship to some of the other principles which we perhaps define in some ways as equal to the one, like the good or the beautiful. And I asked the question because I think it's one of the things we've covered a lot in different ways, where we've looked at some of the parallels between those terms in different thinkers, in different traditions. And I suppose it has different kinds of um, consequences and relations, some of which are moral, as it were, others which are aesthetic. Um, so yeah, I'd be very interested to hear about that in terms of your research, because I think one of the things that we've tried to explore in our discussions is both these finer points of historical, cultural, and metaphysical significance in terms of how we define principles like unity, being, and so on, but also how they form part of a certain kind of experience, which, let's say, one could find one's way to the one through the experience of beauty, and find in that beauty a kind of metaphysical equivalence or parallel uh, to the nature of that principle. So, yeah, I think just to sort of broaden out the discussion slightly, I'd be really interested to hear about that in terms of where you found that in your work, um, and perhaps how it speaks to the traditions that you've been articulating.
All right. Well, there's a lot of questions there. I'll try. I'll sidestep a little bit some of the questions that bear on schisms within the church and so forth, because it's not my field, and I mean,
Yeah, sure.
obviously, it goes without saying that there is a deeper recollection of Platonic concepts in the Eastern Church, simply because access to those texts remained. But of course, that's not to say that they aren't also dramatically transformed by being taken up into a Christian context, which was also in the East more aware of its continual resistance to Platonism. And so, whereas in the West, where access to Plato's texts and to the texts of the major Neoplatonists was almost completely interrupted for a lengthy period of time. It was commonplace to fashion a kind of a fairy tale Plato, who, because he was the kind of paradigmatic ancient wise man, must have, been some sort of a Christian avant la lettre. Whereas in the East, you find people who will say much more critically, well, we don't accept the one of Plato because that's a polytheistic principle. And so, with a more recollection of the intellectual and spiritual struggles of late antiquity in the East, there was also the persistence of an antagonistic relationship with this figure of Plato and with Platonism. Whereas in the West, and I mean, to some extent, we still find this, it was much easier to simply write a narrative that was more congenial about what Plato had been saying all along.
Hmm.
You asked about the relationship between the one and the good. Well, for Platonists, for the Platonic tradition in antiquity, these are one and the same. Um, the principle of individuation is the good because the good has to be the good of each thing. Otherwise, it would not be the good. Uh, each thing must have its good. Each thing must be grounded. If the good of things lay only in their formal being, and when we think about the position of being, we have to think about it as essentially form, intelligibility. Then the good of things would be something that things would have only as much as they could measure up to it, only as much as they could be measured by it. And what you end up with is a temptation towards some sort of radical dualism. Uh, in Platonism, what we see instead is the prevention of dualism through radical plurality. Through the radical affirmation of plurality, we avoid dualism. And part of this is that the good of things is the good of each thing. In order that the good of a thing should not belong rather to something else.
So this is what I love about your work. Sometimes, if I'm honest, I feel like you and I are doing very similar research when it comes to research, but from two different. You come at it from the one, and I come at it from the dyad, and but still at the same time, there's a kind of harmony of opposites to be a punner. But this idea that that in the Platonic tradition, this idea that there's a good, there's a beautiful, even to the speck of dust, right? Even to the seed of the dandelion that floats away, right? That every little thing, even though it doesn't have a form, right? There's something beyond form, right? There's something more than form, and it's this good, it's this beauty, it's this something, the je ne sais quoi, if you will, right? That you could never. So we were going to talk about thinking with the gods, right? But like here, I would argue that to think the Henads or the One or the indefinite dyad requires a more Orphic phanes type of leaping, right? That you have to kind of go into this place as to steal Gareth's verb, dancing, right? Like it's to speak of it, to think of it, is already to want to formalize it, to make it, a unity rather than the principle of unities and individuation and yeah. And so for me, this is actually the heart of Platonism, but it's also the skin or the surface of it, right? So it's this both and.
Well, to speak in perhaps a drier language, it's the difference between acquaintance and description. We describe something through terms that, by their very nature, could apply to more than one thing. We describe something through what it is, but we're acquainted with things by who they are. We have this distinction in our language between what and who, and they had it in Greek too, between ti and tis. Uh, this this sense that through encounter, I encounter the peculiar other, and they encounter me. we've lost the logical sense of the term peculiar. And isn't that peculiar?
Yeah.
You know, um, this is an important logical term, and we'll still find it in the Middle Ages in that sense, but it's dropped out of our everyday language. And so when we say something is peculiar, we mean that it's strange, it's weird. Um, and yet, what it simply means is the sort of thing that you encounter by acquaintance rather than by description. I can give anything a proper name and address it in its peculiarity rather than according to its essentiae, rather than according to its properties. I could give this pen a proper name and address it in its peculiarity, in its uniqueness.
Mhm.
Now, I mean, the Platonic point is that this is metaphysically prior, the peculiarity of something. It's not something that's just given by a form being instantiated in some particular bundle of matter. That's and here's where an idea, a very rich, a very spiritual idea, like reincarnation, metempsychosis, also performs a crucial intellectual function for Platonists. Because if we perform the thought experiment of reincarnation, then we say that I was once something that has no single property possibly in common with what I am now. And I will someday be something that is in no way what I am now. But the very idea of reincarnation is that that other will be who I am still. And here we see, I think, the intellectual value that the doctrine of reincarnation had for Plato, because it enables us to perform what Husserl would later call an eidetic variation upon any particular, and discern, as distinct from any of its other properties, its numerical unity, its peculiarity, its uniqueness. And again, this is the essential logical priority of unity over being. And
Yes.
this is the essence of the Platonic difference with Aristotle, who specifically rejects this and says, no, this is going to result in an anarchic profusion of goods, as he calls it. And he doesn't mean a profusion simply of good things. He means a profusion of capital G goods.
Yep.
He means a profusion of ultimate sources of value. And in order to prevent this, we need to put being first and have a single hierarchical disposition of all things, so that, he says, everything will be organized like a household,
Yep.
with the master at the center and the servants at some distance. And then out beyond the walls, he says, the animals just doing their thing. And he says, mostly at random.
No, I
This is,
always
this is
argue
his
those. Yeah.
vision. Now contrast that with Plato,
Yeah.
who talks about the meadow where all souls gather together, humans and all the other animals, on the same level. Humans choosing their next lives, animals choosing their next lives, animals becoming humans, humans becoming other animals. You see, this is the kind of radical polycentricity is the term that I like to use. I think it's a congenial term. The radical polycentricity of Platonic philosophy relative to what Aristotle staked out as the loyal opposition within the Platonic movement, but which, as it became adopted in Christian circles as an alternative to Platonism. Why did they need an alternative to Platonism? It's because Platonism was the polytheistic philosophy par excellence. It was the enemy. It could only be incorporated into their framework once there were no longer these philosophers who were actually in the tradition of Plato's Academy arguing for their traditional interpretation of the one and all of this. They had to be out of the way. Then there could be a properly Christian interpretation of Plato, which really gathers steam after the closure of the academy and the proscription of non-Christians teaching philosophy within the Roman Empire. Once that debate, which had been raging for centuries, because let's not forget, Plotinus was the first one to say there are these people who want to contract the divine into one, he says. And he says, we need to critique them in the strongest terms. And Porphyry says that he directed his students to continue that after he was gone. It was one of the most important things in his mind. And so already there, at the earliest point at which we could say an intellectual contretemps between Platonists and Christians would even be possible, it was already joined. And it was already joined specifically on the issue of monotheism, on the issue of contracting the divine into one.
Thank you for that. It was just amazing. And I actually want to like draw to build a bridge because one of the debates my husband and I would have early in our marriage, right? Because he's Christian and I am my crazy self, is that he would say like, no, the God has to be a person, right? Has to be a who, and and together we would say, who is it that you say that I am, right? The importance of the personality, right? This is what you, as you were arguing, you come into contact with, right? As this is how the Platonists describe this kind of ascent is a touch, right? It's an all of a sudden connection, right? That goes beyond. So that I think about my love for my husband. If I gave a checklist for all the reasons why I love him, I'm not sure I would love him, right? Like, it's not about the properties. It's about the person that is a who, right? That I can touch.
If someone came along and could check all of those boxes, they'd be just as good.
And this is
You'd
why,
be fine with them too. It's, oh, okay, well, I mean, you fit the bill, so.
yeah, but that's one of the reasons why I think there's this beautiful Platonic spirit within Christianity about the who is it that you say that I am, right? Like you are like you can internalize this divinity, right? And see the God in you, like that kind of, when we think about like the difference between Christianity practiced, right, all over the world versus, the dogmatism that, makes it as if, this is obviously a monotheism, right? When, I know plenty of Christians who want to really emphasize this person of the
Of
Christ.
course, in the fullness of time, and through, crucially, through the self-assertion of polytheist traditions, both continuous and revived polytheist traditions, through that self-assertion, through not settling for the compromises that come, from a place of subordination, that a reciprocal understanding will arise between the polytheist traditions and the monotheist traditions. In particular, of course, I'm thinking about Christianity and Islam, the ones which have been at the forefront of conflict with polytheist traditions in antiquity and today, that there will be a reciprocal understanding, a self-understanding of those traditions which accommodates us. And I mean, I think there already is an understanding of those traditions among polytheists, which accepts their existence and is not fundamentally threatened by their existence, and is even often in fellowship with them in any situation where doctrinal differences aren't being deliberately sharpened in order to stoke conflict. But so I mean, I'm not going to, I'm not going to be, I'm not Pollyanna-ish about
No,
this.
of course
I
not.
mean, there is an asymmetry, and it's the work that belongs to the monotheist faiths to come to an understanding of themselves, of their own doctrines, such that they are not threatened by us. Because I think that you know, uh, speaking in a capacious we polytheists already are obviously comfortable living in a world with them because in the West at least, we live in spaces and move all the time through spaces that are dominated by them.
No, but this is what you were talking about at the very beginning of the episode, which is part of what it means to be in the mysteries, if you will, is to hold the mystery, right? This enigmatic relationship between the one and the many. That's part and parcel of what it means to be a Platonist.
Thing is that there's nothing about who-ness
Mhm.
that implies singularity in the sense that rejects multiplicity. This is the big logical shift that I'm trying to argue is necessary in order to understand fundamentally where these ancient philosophers are coming from, is to understand that it's moving on a different axis. When we talk about the difference between who and what, we talk about uniqueness.
Yep.
And there is only one you, but obviously there are many that share any property of yours that I could specify, but
Mhm.
there's only one you. Nevertheless, it is a positive unity.
Yep.
It's not a negative unity. It's not, I don't get at the encounter with you, the experience of you, by some kind of pruning away of multiplicity. Rather, it's the positive givenness of encounter.
Mhm. No, I tend to think of like to help other people understand this one many situation with regards to the uniqueness and infinite uniqueness that constitutes the divine. You have to just go within, right? Or like the kind of one that we are is a paradox because that when we think about ourselves and the who we are, it's so many infinite things. This is why we think about archetypes, right? Like that when we recognize archetypical aspect of somebody's journey or life, we're seeing that liminal something, that liminal uniqueness that somehow is in this other unique thing, and so it kind of shared something, not, but can't be a property because it can never be repeated. And so here, like when we're trying to understand or have self-knowledge about this idiotes, right? This is another like peculiar has been forgotten. When we call somebody an idiot, I'm always like, that can't. How? Why is that something bad, right? It means the singularity,
Exactly.
like oh,
Exactly.
that's pretty cool. But long and the short of it is that we can discover all of this when we heed the Greek command or the Heraclitean command of go within and you can find an infinity of resources, uniquenesses, if you will, peculiarities with regards to being a one. And I always find it astounding that don't, we always want to make the one a singular one versus remembering what it's like to be a one ourselves as living things that can never be.
Precisely, and this goes to a point that Gareth was speaking about in terms of spiritual experience, experiential mysticism, monasticism. What I find is that people who have a powerful and intense religious life are too busy unpacking the encounter with who, the who of their God, to worry very much about what other people are doing and about trying to control other spaces. Because they are, as you say, like Heraclitus, they are experiencing such a vast world in that encounter, in that devotional encounter, which by its nature is all encompassing, but it's all encompassing not in a spirit of negation, but in a spirit of affirmation. This is the Vishvarupa of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. And this is equally the uniqueness of the encounter of the Christian with their God, of the Muslim with their God. People who are consumed by this experience don't have time for being prescriptive to others about their experiences. And William James said somewhere that, all that you can have as an actual religious experience is an experience of some God. You can't be given in an experience that the other person's God doesn't exist. You may have a process of inference from your experience that leads you to that conclusion, but that can't be given positively in experience because religious experience is primordially and fundamentally positive. It's an experience of givenness, not of not of negation, not of removal.
I was thinking of a couple of things here, that a quotation that speaks to a couple of your points here. And certainly, yeah, in the Christian tradition, if one would say one is made in the image of God, and if there are as many images of God as there are people, then our own encounter with God takes that deeply inner journey. And yeah, I just, it's interesting that this quote I'd come across today in a text that I've read a number of times on the inner nature of things, which is by an Athonite monk. And he says, "What I am is not at all the same as that which characterizes me, nor is what characterizes me the same as that which relates to my situation, nor is what relates to my situation the same as that which is external to me. In each case, the one is distinct from the other. What I am is an image of God, manifest in a spiritual, immortal, and intelligent soul." So, I think that sense of that sort of radical individuation, but also that sort of radical plurality, as it were, is precisely described in that sort of spiritual exercise, and shows us ways, I think, that perhaps one can find bridges, as it were, between the traditions you've described.
This has been amazing. We'll have to wrap up now, but Edward, I hope that you would consider revisiting and coming back
Sure.
I love it. And so thanks again,
Of
everybody.
course.
I learned a lot. And Gareth, thanks for wrapping things up with that beautiful passage. And so.
Oh dear diorama, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh dear diorama, tell me why is the good never good enough underneath the dirt?